It began on a quiet evening in the small Costa Rican town of Colorado, a place too ordinary to expect miracles, where the hills of Guanacaste rolled gently beneath a fading orange sky and the air smelled of dust, mango trees, and candle wax from the little white church that stood at the edge of the road, its red roof glowing faintly as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Inside that church, Padre Ronald Rojas Gómez was preparing for the evening mass, moving with the slow patience of a man who understood that every gesture, no matter how small, could become prayer. His cassock was simple, the sleeves slightly frayed from years of wear, and around his neck hung a wooden cross carved long ago by a local carpenter, a reminder of humility and service. He had spent his life in that parish, baptizing children, blessing fields, comforting the sick, burying the dead, never seeking attention or fame, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that God still walked among ordinary people. That evening, as the sound of roosters faded into the hum of motorbikes heading home for dinner, families began to gather beneath the shadow of the bell tower, their footsteps slow, their whispers low, as if some unspoken anticipation had settled over the town. Mothers carried flowers to the altar, children chased one another outside until the first bell rang, and an old woman named Doña Teresa, her hands twisted with age, but her spirit unbroken, took her usual seat in the second pew, with her granddaughter Lucia beside her, a shy girl with restless eyes, who rarely prayed but had learned to love the stillness that came when the hymns began. The priest entered from the sacristy, and the church fell into silence, not out of fear, but reverence, the kind of silence that feels alive, as though the air itself were waiting for something unseen. He began the liturgy with his calm and steady voice, speaking of faith, of the simple trust that endures when life makes no sense, and as he spoke, the light from the candles flickered across his face, casting a soft glow that seemed almost to breathe with him. The people listened closely, their worries dissolving into the rhythm of his words, and Lucia, who had never truly understood why her grandmother came every night, suddenly found herself leaning forward, caught by something she could not name. When the offertory hymn began, the congregation moved as one body, bringing forward their small offerings, fruits from their gardens, loaves of bread, a few coins wrapped in cloth, and placing them gently on the altar, each gift a fragment of their lives, transformed into devotion. A last ray of sunlight entered through the window, striking the silver chalice so that for an instant it gleamed like liquid fire, and the priest paused, his gaze fixed on it, as though recognizing a sign he had long awaited. The air grew heavier, thicker, yet not oppressive. It felt instead like the presence of something vast, invisible, benevolent. As the final notes of the hymn faded into silence, Padre Ronald took a deep breath and began the Eucharistic prayer, his voice softer now, almost trembling with a kind of sacred exhaustion. The candles burned steadily, their flames motionless, as if held by an unseen hand, and the faint sound of wind outside became part of the rhythm of the Mass. He raised the host slowly above the chalice, his eyes fixed upon it, his lips moving in words older than the language of the people who listened, and for a moment, time itself seemed to hesitate. It was then, in that breathless stillness, that the impossible happened. The host began to shine. At first, it was subtle, a gentle shimmer, like the reflection of sunlight on water, but within seconds the glow deepened, spreading outward, until it filled the church with a warm, golden light that had no source, no flame, no shadow. The walls seemed to breathe, the faces of the faithful were washed in radiance, and the air itself began to hum with a low, trembling resonance that made every heart in the room beat as one. Lucia gasped softly, clutching her grandmother's hand, and Doña Teresa whispered a prayer without words, her eyes fixed on the altar where the ordinary bread of the earth had become something unearthly. The priest's hands, still holding the host, were no longer visible. The light surrounded them completely, pulsating gently, alive, like the rhythm of a heart. Some began to cry, others fell to their knees, and even the children grew silent, their small faces reflecting the same astonishment that filled the room. It was not the blinding light of fire or the harsh glare of electricity. It was a living warmth, a softness that embraced rather than consumed, as though heaven had lowered itself just enough to touch the human soul. For those few seconds, nothing existed outside that moment. The world had stopped, and the boundaries between seen and unseen dissolved. Padre Ronald stood motionless, unable to move, unable to speak. His body trembled, but his heart felt lifted, weightless, consumed not by fear, but by awe. He could feel the heat of the light flow through his veins, gentle yet overwhelming, until all sense of where his hands ended and where the divine began was lost. Someone in the back raised a phone and took a photograph, not knowing that the flash would be swallowed instantly by the radiance of the altar, leaving only one image burned into the lens, a circle of gold where the host had been. No trace of the priest's hands, no shadow, only light. Then, as softly as it had come, the glow began to fade, receding into the stillness like a tide returning to the sea. Padre Ronald lowered the host slowly, his face pale, his eyes glistening, his breath uneven. He whispered something only God could hear, then placed the consecrated host back onto the paten with a trembling hand. The church remained utterly silent. Even the candles seemed reluctant to flicker. No one dared to move, as if the air itself demanded reverence for what it had just witnessed. And in that silence, so deep it seemed eternal, the mystery of heaven lingered. By the time the priest gave the final blessing that night, the silence had not left the room. It lingered like incense, thick and sweet, suspended in the air, long after the last hymn had faded. No one rushed to the door, no one spoke above a whisper, as if words might break something fragile and holy. The faces of the faithful were still marked by that golden glow they had seen moments earlier, their eyes wide and glistening, their breathing shallow, as though each of them had just returned from a place the world could not find on any map. Padre Ronald stood motionless for a while, unable to move, unsure whether to trust his senses or his faith, and when he finally looked down at his trembling hands, they seemed foreign to him, instruments of something greater, tools of a mystery that had chosen him without warning or reason. Outside, the stars had begun to appear, scattered like small promises above the valley, and the little church, now dark except for its candles, seemed to hold a faint afterglow, as if the walls themselves remembered what they had seen. People stepped out quietly, some holding rosaries, others wiping tears, children whispering questions their parents could not answer. Lucia walked beside her grandmother, her heart pounding with a mixture of awe and confusion, unable to put into words the strange warmth that still filled her chest. "Abuela," she asked softly, "was that God?" Doña Teresa did not reply immediately. She looked up at the night sky, her lips trembling, and then said only, "When light comes from heaven, Hija, it never leaves." By morning, the town had changed. The roosters crowed, as always. The dust rose along the same old roads, but something invisible hung over Colorado, a vibration of wonder that made even ordinary sounds seem softer. The photo taken during the Mass began to circulate among the parishioners. It showed the altar bathed in an otherworldly glow, the host burning like a small sun, the priest's hands erased in pure light. At first it passed quietly from phone to phone, then from one Facebook page to another, until by noon it had reached thousands of people across Latin America. The caption beneath the image read simply, "Milagro de la Eucaristía, la luz del Señor en la misa del Padre Ronald Rojas Gómez." Comments poured in faster than the priest could comprehend. "Dios está presente," wrote one woman. "Gracias Señor por recordarnos que no estamos solos," said another. Some left only emojis, hands in prayer, hearts, tears, candles. To many, it was more than a photograph. It was proof, a sign that heaven had not gone silent, that in a forgotten corner of the world, God had spoken again through light. When a parishioner showed the image to Padre Ronald after morning Mass, he stared at the screen for a long time, unable to speak. It was exactly as he remembered, the radiance, the warmth, the way the air itself had vibrated with presence. Yet seeing it captured on a screen filled him not with pride, but unease. "If this is from God," he said quietly, "it is not for me, it is for them." He closed his eyes for a moment and added, almost as a confession, "Sometimes the light does not reveal, it reminds." Within hours, journalists began calling. Local television crews appeared outside the small church, and the faithful arrived from nearby towns to see the place where the miracle had occurred. They came barefoot, some carrying flowers, others kneeling in the dust, whispering prayers at the doorstep. The church that had once held 30 people now overflowed with hundreds. The songs were louder, the prayers longer, the silences deeper. People came to touch the altar, to kneel where the light had appeared, to breathe the same air that had once glowed. But not everyone believed. Some called it a reflection, a trick of light, a glitch of the camera lens. Others said it was the flicker of candles caught at the perfect moment. A few spoke harshly, accusing the priest of seeking attention, of manufacturing devotion through spectacle. Padre Ronald refused every interview, declined every invitation to speak on television, and when asked by a reporter outside the church what he thought of the so-called miracle, he answered simply, "God works in silence. What we saw, each must decide what it means for them." That night, after the last visitor had gone and the bells had stopped ringing, he remained alone in the church, seated before the altar where it had happened. The candles had burned low, the air was heavy with wax and incense, and the faint hum of crickets filled the space where voices had been hours before. He looked at the pattern, at the chalice, at the crucifix above the tabernacle, and felt an ache that was not fear but humility. For years he had preached about faith, about believing without seeing, and now that he had seen, he realized that faith was not about sight at all. It was about surrender. He whispered a prayer into the stillness. "Señor, if your light was meant for them, let it stay with them. Let it not fade as the photograph fades. Let it be in their hearts." Then he sat in the dark, listening to the distant wind passing through the mango trees, and for the first time since the miracle, he felt peace. Within a week, the story had reached the diocese in Liberia, where the bishop, a cautious man shaped by decades of witnessing both genuine devotion and dangerous enthusiasm, requested that everything be handled with discretion. No declarations, no public statements, no rush to call it miracle or illusion, only time. Time to pray, to listen, and to understand. A small group of priests and theologians was sent quietly to Colorado, arriving in plain clothes so as not to draw attention, though the people recognized them instantly. Strangers with notebooks never went unnoticed in a town that measured its days by church bells. They spoke with the parishioners, inspected the altar, measured the angle of the candles, studied the stained glass windows, and asked the man who had taken the photograph to point to the exact spot where he had stood. The investigation was calm, methodical, respectful. They found no unusual wiring, no mirrors, no hidden bulbs or tricks, only a small church whose beauty was its simplicity, and a priest who still looked bewildered whenever anyone mentioned the word milagro. What puzzled them most was not the image itself, but the aftermath. In the days following the light, confession lines stretched out to the street. Men who had not set foot in church for 20 years knelt side by side with the women who prayed for them. Old feuds dissolved without explanation, and the town, once divided by small quarrels and quiet pride, suddenly began to move as one body. Even the young, those who had laughed at religion and mocked the faith of their grandparents, began coming to Mass, sitting in the back at first, arms crossed, pretending indifference, yet staying long after the final blessing, their eyes fixed on the same altar that had once burned with radiance. The investigators could measure angles and luminosity, but they could not measure what was happening inside those hearts, and one of them, an older Jesuit with weary eyes, finally said to the others, "Even if a camera could produce light, it cannot produce repentance." Meanwhile, the world outside continued to feed on the image. Catholic pages reposted it, skeptics debated it, journalists dissected it, and thousands who had never heard of the town of Colorado now spoke its name with either reverence or scorn. Padre Ronald watched it all unfold from a distance. He refused to check his phone, refused to answer reporters, and when parishioners asked what they should believe, he answered, "Believe what makes you love God more." Yet something inside him had shifted forever. Each time he approached the altar, he felt a trembling in his chest that had not been there before, a mixture of awe and fear, as though he had seen too much of heaven to ever feel at home on earth again. At night, when the church was empty, he would sit alone in the front pew and stare at the crucifix. The candles cast long shadows, and the carved face of Christ seemed almost alive in the shifting light. He would think of that evening, the warmth, the glow, the sound of silence so complete, it felt alive, and he would ask himself why God had chosen that place, that moment, that simple bread. Sometimes he wondered if the miracle had not been the light itself, but what it awakened, a renewal of faith that required no proof, no photograph, only the memory of a radiance that once filled their hearts. Lucia, the girl who had sat beside her grandmother that night, began coming to Mass every evening. She no longer came out of duty, but out of hunger. Something within her longed to be near that altar again. She started helping the choir, sweeping the floors, lighting the candles, writing in a small notebook after each service, trying to capture in words the things she could not explain. One evening, she approached Padre Ronald after confession, nervous and trembling, and told him she had been writing about what she saw. "It wasn't just light," she said. "It was like love had taken form, like something inside me broke and healed at the same time." The priest listened in silence and finally answered, "That is how God enters quietly, through the cracks." In the following weeks, small transformations began to ripple through the town. A man who had not spoken to his brother for 2 decades walked to his house one morning and knocked without a word. A woman who had carried bitterness since her husband's death began volunteering to feed the poor. Teenagers repainted the church walls, repaired the benches, and visited the sick. No one called these things miracles, yet everyone felt they were part of the same light that had once filled the church. The diocese, observing from afar, made no official declaration, but the bishop, reading the reports of his investigators, wrote privately in his notes, "Perhaps the true miracle is not in the photograph, but in the fruit." Months passed, and the noise of social media began to fade. New stories rose, new controversies replaced the old ones, and the photograph that had once filled every screen sank slowly into digital oblivion. But in Colorado, something remained, a stillness, a quiet pulse of grace that could not be undone by forgetfulness. The pews filled earlier than before, the songs were sung with more conviction, and even the children seemed to understand that they were part of something holy. Padre Ronald continued as he always had, celebrating Mass with the same calm devotion, never claiming anything, never denying anything, simply allowing the mystery to breathe through the ordinary. And sometimes, at the moment of consecration, when he lifted the host, he felt a warmth against his palms, not a light the eyes could see, but a presence that seemed to whisper, "I am still here." Time, as it always does, began to move again. Gently at first, like a slow tide returning to the shore, and life in Colorado resumed its familiar rhythm, though something invisible had changed its pulse. The rainy season came, painting the hills green once more, and the sound of roosters echoed through the morning air, just as it always had. But for those who had been in the church that night, every sunrise carried a quiet echo of gold. People no longer spoke constantly about the miracle, some because they feared disbelief, others because words seemed too small, but the memory of that light lived within them like a hidden ember that refused to die. Lucia had grown since then, not in years, but in soul. She came early to every Mass, helping the choir arrange the hymn books, lighting the candles one by one, her fingers trembling slightly each time the flame touched the wick. She no longer tried to explain what she had seen. She had stopped searching for language and learned instead to let silence say what words could not. When she sang, her voice, once shy and uncertain, rose with a clarity that filled the small church like an offering. The people listened differently now. They prayed not out of habit, but out of remembrance, as though their faith had been cleansed by light. Doña Teresa's health, however, began to fade. She grew quieter, smaller, her hands too weak to hold her rosary for long, though she still kept it close to her chest. Each evening she sat in her usual pew, her eyes closed, her lips moving in prayer, while her granddaughter knelt beside her. One morning, Lucia found her still there, her fingers gently wrapped around the beads, her face peaceful, as if she had simply drifted into the light she had waited for all her life. At her funeral, the church overflowed. The entire town came to say goodbye to the woman who had prayed them through every storm. Padre Ronald spoke softly, his voice trembling as he said, "She prayed every day to see the light of God. I believe tonight she finally does." After the funeral, as the candles burned low and the mourners left in silence, the priest remained alone. The evening sun spilled through the doorway, turning the air a faint amber, and the dust shimmered like 1,000 tiny stars. He walked slowly to the back of the church, where the photograph had been framed and hung, no longer as evidence, but as memory. It showed that same radiant circle above the altar, the priest's hands erased by brilliance, and for a long time he simply stared at it, not searching for meaning anymore, but thanking God for the fact that it had happened at all. He sat in the front pew, as he often did after Mass, his cassock slightly worn, his hands folded in his lap. The church was silent, except for the faint rustle of wind through the mango trees. Sometimes he thought of all the noise the photo had made, the interviews, the posts, the disbelief, and he smiled faintly at how quickly the world forgets what it cannot explain. Yet what mattered most had never been the photograph. The miracle was not what had appeared before their eyes. It was what had remained afterward, the way the people loved one another more, forgave more easily, prayed with deeper stillness. He whispered quietly into the empty church, "Señor, if your light ever returns, let it not shine upon my hands, but within their hearts." The candles flickered in agreement, their flames bowing slightly in the draught from the door, and he closed his eyes, remembering that night, the warmth, the hush, the trembling glow that had swallowed time itself. He had long since stopped asking why. He had learned that miracles were not spectacles to be analyzed, but invitations to remember that God had never left, that he still walked quietly among his people, speaking in light, in silence, in the unremarkable beauty of faith rediscovered. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping softly against the roof. The valley smelled of wet earth and jasmine, the same scent that had filled the air the night the host had shone like the sun. Somewhere beyond the clouds, the stars were waiting to be seen again, and the priest felt that quiet certainty, that same wordless peace that had followed the miracle and never truly departed. The photo might fade one day, the paper might yellow, the edges curl, but what it captured could not be erased. The moment heaven bent low enough for ordinary eyes to see, if only for a breath, that faith itself was the light, and that the smallest belief, once kindled, could illuminate a lifetime. The night returns now to Colorado as it always has, quiet and unhurried. The sound of wind moving through the mango leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the slow toll of the church bell calling the faithful to an ordinary mass that no longer feels ordinary at all. The walls of the little white chapel breathe softly with age. Its candles still flicker, its hymns still rise, but beneath the surface of those familiar rituals there lingers something unseen, a warmth that does not come from fire, a stillness that does not come from silence, a memory that time has refused to steal. Somewhere in the back of the church the photograph remains, framed and fading, its once bright light now dim under glass. Yet everyone who kneels before it feels that same unexplainable calm, as though the air itself remembers what it once held. They do not come to see proof anymore. They come to remember what faith feels like when heaven decides to touch the earth. The faces are older now, the seasons have changed, but the light has never left them. It has only hidden itself deeper, where hands cannot reach and cameras cannot capture. And when Padre Ronald, older now, slower in step, raises the host again each evening, no radiance fills the church, no golden fire descends, yet every heart still leans forward in the same quiet expectation. He knows that the miracle did not end when the light faded. It began when it did, when belief turned from something seen to something lived. He whispers the same prayer he has whispered 1,000 times, Señor, que esto sea para tu gloria, and the sound seems to blend with the wind, the breath of candles, the sigh of the valley itself. In that moment, the town of Colorado feels suspended between earth and eternity. Its people held in a light that no photograph could ever keep, the kind of light that exists only in the soul, a reminder that God does not reveal himself through thunder or spectacle, but through the quiet persistence of faith that chooses to believe even when nothing shines. And somewhere beyond the hills, beyond the night, the heavens listen in silence, smiling at a truth as old as creation itself, that the smallest flame, if guarded with love, is enough to light the whole world.